Hello, everyone, and welcome to Geopolitics and Journalism, organized by the Center for Geopolitics at the University of Cambridge. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. My name is Elvira Tamus. I'm a PhD candidate at the Faculty of History and a research assistant at the Center. I'm delighted to be chairing tonight's event. This event is part of our ongoing Geopolitics and series, which explores how geopolitics shape the arts and humanities and how, in turn, they shape geopolitics. We have previously held highly engaging events on art and war, documentary and war, as well as geopolitics and memory. Tonight's webinar will explore how journalists shape public understanding of geopolitical conflicts and how geopolitics in turn shapes journalism. We will look at the challenges of reporting from conflict zones, the politics of information, and the role of media in framing global events, touching on issues such as access, bias, credibility, risk, and the responsibilities of the press in an increasingly polarized world. Our three speakers will give brief opening remarks, followed by a 30-minute roundtable discussion. We will then dedicate the final approximately 30 minutes to audience questions. A few housekeeping notes. The chat function for this webinar is disabled, but the Q&A is open. Please feel free to submit your questions at any time. We will address them during the Q&A session. You may direct your question to a specific speaker or to the panel as a whole. To learn more about the Cambridge Center for Geopolitics, including our research strands, upcoming events, and publications, do follow us on LinkedIn, X, Facebook, and Blue Sky. Please do visit our website and subscribe to our newsletter. And please note that this event is being recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. And now, without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce tonight's distinguished speakers. Jeremy Edelman is the director of the Global History Lab at the University of Cambridge and the Henry Charles Lee Professor Emeritus of History at Princeton University. The author and editor of a number of books about Latin America and world history, his most recent works include Narratives, Nations, and Other Word Products, Inventing the Third Word, and the forthcoming Depending on Strangers, Arguments about Global Integration Since Adam Smith, to be published in 2025 with Princeton University Press. Mary Hockaday is Master of Trinity Hall, where she studied English as an undergraduate. Until 2022, she was Controller of BBC World Service English. From 2009 to 2014, she was head of the BBC newsroom, overseeing the BBC's core news services on radio, television, and online for domestic and global audiences. Mary was editor of BBC World Service News and Current Affairs from 2001 to 2006. WSNCA won a special Sonny Gold Award in recognition of its 9/11 coverage. She serves on the board of the British Library and is the author of Kafka, Love and Courage, The Life of Milena Jesenska. Roger Mosey is the Master of Selwyn College and the Deputy Vice-Chancellor of the University of Cambridge. Previously, he spent most of his career at BBC. His final role was as editorial director, and previous jobs included being editor of Today on BBC Radio 4, controller of BBC Radio 5 Live, head of BBC Television News, Director of Sport, and the BBC Director of London, 2012. Jeremy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Elvira, for the invitation. It's an honor to be with you and with Roger and Mary to talk about a very topical topic about journalism and geopolitics. I think maybe we're all perhaps historians in some very basic way, but I'll approach the conversation as to talk about the past. Though we live in a very fevered and polarized moment, I think we'll wind up talking a lot about that and the role of the media and the news in particular, journalism in creating it or stymieing it. But I'd just like to perhaps start by saying this is not entirely new debate or problem. In fact, it's been around since the modern print journalism that we recognize of the 19th century really began to take off. Though there was um, in a sense, a golden age of repertorial objectivity, an idea, some might say a myth, about the role of the media and the public sphere that, say, crested from the 1920s to the 1970s, in which the Fourth Estate played a kind of heroic role, and one might say internalized that self-image as an impartial observer, speaking truth to power, and engaged in informing public discourse from a position, in some senses, outside it. And this one might say, culminated in the mid 1970s with the legend around the Watergate saga and Washington Post's heroic role in bringing down the Nixon administration. I'll come back to the 1970s in just a minute. But for most of the history of modern media, there was a much more ambiguous and complicated role, and that's what I want to get into. And of course, now this ambiguity is shading into a lot of alarm. As I said, I'm sure we're going to get into that, but let's start on the ambiguity and before we get into the alarm. So Elvira sent us five really provocative questions. I really only have one of the questions, which is about what one might do practically about this. I'm not going to address because I think Mary and Roger are going to have much more experience and will have thought much more about this than I will. So I'm really going to address four of Elvira's challenge questions. Um, and and see where we go and perhaps offer some prompts for exchange. I mean, the first one that Elvira asked us to think about was the role of the media in informing or framing public opinion. And this has been around from the very beginning, from the idea in the 18th century of a public sphere that would be informed by a reasoned and impartial world of the press. But by the late 19th century, this idea of a reasoned space of impartiality and rational discourse really began to be challenged. And here I'm going to switch over, I'm going to share screen and use a few prompt images. So bear with me as I grope around. Share. Here is just to go um, into a slideshow presentation. This is an image from 1898 from the New York Journal. The image was a very famous image called The Naked Truth. That was what it was tagged at the time for obvious reasons. This is a newspaper published by William Randolph Hearst. Some of you may know about him and the importance of yellow journalism in the United States. He was, of course, involved in a competition with Joseph Pulitzer, publisher of the New York World, and the controversy around going to war against Spain in 1898 was electrified by the ways in which both Hearst and Pulitzer mobilized an impression of Cuba in particular, but to some extent Philippines, as in need of being rescued from Spanish atrocities and abuses that Spaniards were taking against Americans, in particular with the explosion on one of the warships that was in Havana Harbor. We now know, and it was sort of known at the time, that this was a war manufactured by newspapers in order to sell news. And even at the time, enormous amount of controversy around the role that the media had in framing opinions about whether or not to go to war. And of course, the war made for careers as well. Teddy Roosevelt would make a name for himself as the head of a group of soldiers called the Rough Riders. So the war as rather the media as a generator of events that would make claims on public authority has been around for an enormous amount of time. Call it the tail wagging the dog phenomenon. it could also play the opposite role. It's worth saying. Let's switch to another slide. Perhaps, sorry, this is slightly, I'll move this over so you can see it better. Um, because it was in the wake of 1898 war that American troops got bogged down in an occupation in the Philippines and Cuba and practiced things like water boarding, which would become infamous once again during the Iraq War. Uh, and these wars of occupation would become enormously controversial, and those wars would become increasingly unpopular. So the media also, and the images of what was these atrocities that were happening and barbarities being performed by American soldiers against, in this case, Filipinos, um, was very controversial, and led, in some senses, to the rise of an anti-war sentiment. Mark Twain would very famously come out against the U.S. government for its hypocrisy and its limitations. So it's not as if journalism was always complicit with war-making machines. It could also have the other effect. The second question that Elvira asked us to consider was whether the role that international correspondents play in the relationship with local correspondents and how this might shape the global narrative. This too has been a source of a lot of controversy and discussion from the rise of the commercialized press in the 19th century. And it's particularly been, and I'm just going to focus on one part of this, um, around the stereotypes of other peoples, of strangers far away, and particularly classical problem for humanitarian photography. Um, this is a very famous image of Rosalind Carter in late 1979. She's the wife of the then President Jimmy Carter, pays a visit to a refugee camp on the Thai side of the border with Cambodia. Um, and this image, this is before the digital age, it went viral. It was part of a campaign to stir up support for a flagging Jimmy Carter administration playing its humanitarian card. The image itself would be very controversial for the ways in which it was staged as something that would drum up political support. And photographers, and this photograph is particularly helpful because you can see the photographer right behind her with the camera dangling from around his neck, uh, in order to portray, in this particular case, the drama around Cambodian refugees as helpless children in need of savior by external humanitarian actors. And while local journalists who were telling quite a different story about the nature of the atrocities of the Khmer Rouge were being elbowed aside in favor of this American portrait. So this tension between local representations of what's going on and the global manufacture of an image of what's happening has also been present for a long time. Um, so there's a lot going on around there's a history behind the images and stories themselves. And I should say that it's partly in response to controversies like that one, and this may be getting to the question about what can be done to overcome this, is that organizations have thought about the ways in which local and global reporters might work together in collaboration. This is an image of a bombed out Aleppo from relatively early days in the Syrian civil war, taken by a consortium of by a Syrian photographer who was part of a consortium called the Aleppo Media Center, which was itself created by between Syrian journalists, British journalists, and French journalists as a collaborative to try to bridge that gap between local reportage and the global journalists, to get the Syrian portrait of what was happening in Aleppo out into the wider world. And this was a very interesting, not the first, but it was a very illuminating experience, especially at the dawn of the digital social media age. Some of us, we might talk about this in more detail, but the Syrian civil war was really the first war to be fought simultaneously in the battlefield and in social medias. Facebook and other platforms had just recently been constructed at the time. And so the media center in Aleppo was in part an international consortium with local partners designed to inform global public opinion. So it's not as if this is an insuperable problem between these two scales of production. The third question that Elvira asked us to think about is what journalists can do to address credibility. And I'm looking forward to Mary and Roger's thoughts on this. I thought I would uh, talk about, in the vein of this idea of collaboration, um, to spotlight the role in particular around the reportage of Lindsay Addario, who's one of the celebrity photojournalists now working for the New York Times. Um, and her role in portraying the massacres in Ukraine early on in the war. And here's an image of a family that had been shot in Irpin. This is early in the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The image, and you can see in the way Christiane Amanpour herself will use the image of the New York Times use of the image itself as to portray a story about the atrocities performed by Russian troops. What's important about this? There are many things going on in the image itself, and um, among the things that began to happen in order to verify the credibility of the image itself is the amount of work that the New York Times, in particular, put into checking against CCTV images. In this particular case, another photograph taken by Andrei Dubček, who was a very important Ukrainian photographer operating in the field at the time, to verify the authenticity of the image itself. Satellite images. So when the story rolled out, an enormous amount of work went on in the background to make sure that Lindsay Addario's image was not what we would now call fake news. And so that the portrait of Tatiana Perebinis and her two children who had been shot and who had been killed in the streets of Irpin would be credible. The problem, of course, and this I'll end on this the third question is that, of course, this is slow, painstaking work, which is a problem in this accelerated, hyper volatile social media world. And what's happened to heritage media that has invested so much in the ability to verify and validate now is on its heels. And perhaps frame that as a question, the extent to which this is part of the crisis of representation, that the work that goes into validating or verifying these images and stories presumes an investment in truth that's not there for other actors. So last question, how is technology reshaping reporting? Well, here too, it's not an entirely new question. This is Vietnam. This is 1975. Oh, sorry, this is 1972. This is the shooters shooting shooters. Uh, um, and we forget earlier disruptions. The camera itself, when it arrived on the stage, alarmed many people about whether it could be an objective device. Cheap newsprint and linotype that made for the possibility of the New York world that generated the 1898 war, radio in the 1920s, television, of course, in Vietnam, as the first televised war. Always spurred controversy around reportage and objectivity, and of course the digital turn and the rise of the pixelated image and its circulation has only intensified many of these debates. I'll end just on one note, is that in the middle of this, as we watch the journalists recording the war, and that the war increasingly becoming about its reportage, Susan Sontag wrote a series of essays in the New York Review of Books about photography and in the heat of the Vietnam War, and worried about what she called dissociative seeing. That is, in the society of spectacles and the commodification of news, that audiences, readers, news consumers were viewing more but observing less. She was concerned, and this was decades ago, about this problem about the saturation of the public sphere um, with news and the difficulty that people had in empathizing with the plight of strangers. So if that's a key question for us in thinking about geopolitics and journalism, I think going back and looking at some of these earlier controversies might be very helpful guides. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jeremy, for this fascinating start. Mary, please.
Thank you very much, Elvira and Jeremy. Really interesting. A hard act to follow because you've set some big questions and big thoughts. It's a real pleasure to be here this evening. I was thinking about the audience, and of course, all of you, one way or another, you're interested in what goes on in the world. I suspect that many of you, like me, have been rather baffled the last couple of years, and not for all the obvious reasons that we are all baffled. Because suddenly the word geopolitics is everywhere. Every other week, there's some organization or company or board inviting people to, think about how geopolitics is now relevant to the world and their businesses, and that companies must think about geopolitics alongside, risk and AI and all the rest of it. I'm sort of thinking, really? I think geopolitics has been with us and worth thinking about for really quite a long time. As a journalist at the BBC and quite frequently involved in global news, world service at the beginning and the ends of my career, but even when I was running the newsroom with a big focus also on our domestic audiences and the domestic agenda, global news was always part of it. So it's really nice to be among friends and people for whom the word geopolitics is not a novelty. And certainly, if I look back over my career years at the BBC, there was plenty of foreign news. I began sort of the late 80s, and of course Tiananmen and the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then we hurtled on through a slightly calmer 1990s, perhaps. But then, to the new century, 9/11, Afghanistan, Iraq. A little later, the financial crash, then we're on to Arab uprisings, Syria, Iraq. Before you know it, we're into Brexit, first Trump presidency, Xi Jinping's second term, and the abolition of term limits, and then it's COVID, and before you know it, here we are with a war in Ukraine and a second Trump presidency. And of course, through all of those years, other less obvious dramatic events, but big stories: global warming, rise in immigration, shifts in globalization. So no shortage of news. But if we're to think about geopolitics, it's not just foreign news, but something about the underlying trends of the balance of power in the world, and of conflicts, and of shifting tectonic plates that lie beneath some of these sort of popping events. The picture's a little different, perhaps. I'm very much not an academic. I'm not a political theorist, but it does seem to me that there were periods when geopolitics seemed a more stable or comparatively stable backdrop to events. And perhaps as journalists, we rather got in the habit of taking that stability for granted. But that's not true all the time. And of course, the end of the Soviet Union and the Cold War, the events of 9/11, the financial crash, even a journalist obsessed about what's going on today could see that these events did have real impact on the global shifts of power and big trends. And of course, China's rise, and more recently Putin's invasion of both Crimea and then all of Ukraine, the Trump presidency, these are really shifting geopolitics, and the tectonic plates feel pretty lively. I think, Roger would agree if I sort of make a confession on behalf of news and the daily news business. We are a bit notorious for being obsessed with the dramatic, what's happened today, the here and now. We're not always so good at trends and longer term shifts. But working at the BBC, and if you think about any big major credible newspaper or news organisation or broadcaster, you know, I would say that actually there always has been, and there's plenty of room for journalism that does go deeper and to be proud of. You know, at the BBC, we were always lucky to have specialists as well as daily news reporters, whether that was foreign correspondents or, you know, those who were brave enough to go to conflict zones, diplomatic correspondents, regional specialists who really saw it as their job to look beneath the headlines at some of what was going on and give a broader and a deeper analysis. There are lots of questions we'll address today. I'm going in my remarks to focus perhaps on two of the key questions that Elvira set us, knowing that the others will emerge as well. And I want to talk particularly both about framing, but also about the challenges of reporting, the practical challenges of reporting from conflict and other hostile and repressive zones. So framing, and you know, Jeremy's already been very eloquent about this. If I think about framing in a sort of practical way in terms of the business of journalism, it seems that there are two key aspects to it, and I'll just give a couple of examples of both. So first of all, it's about story choice. It's about the agenda that you choose to look at or not to look at. And those very first decisions make a difference really to the world you are showing your audience, what choices you make. There is no doubt that if you're the BBC, your first focus is the domestic audience, the domestic news agenda, and that's busy enough. But then you start to work your way out, and the first areas of interest that come next are our neighbours, our partners, so of course Europe, but also the States, and then the global events and trends and parts of the world that feel perhaps most salient, relevant to our audiences. And obviously, you know, it ebbs and flows, but so frequently that has included the Middle East, China, other parts of Asia. I would confess, even when I was at World Service, where our focus was really to try and think about what mattered to a global audience, what were the most important events on a given day or week for global audiences, I always knew that although we tried hard to do that, we underreported Latin America. Sorry, Jeremy, I could go into why a bit more, but you know, it just was a practical truth and almost a sort of news market reality about that. You can look also, I would say, at Al Jazeera and give them real credit for paying perhaps more attention than some other global and Western broadcasters to parts of the Middle East and to Africa. And that's really important. And I think perhaps sometimes, you know, explains why for some Western audiences, it's been something of a surprise to realize that not all parts of the world immediately assume that the Europe and America are kind of right in their response to Ukraine and to Putin. And in that, you know, very sort of black and white, it's simple to see who's right, who's wrong here. That's not necessarily a view shared in the global South. And sometimes I think, you know, Western reporting has been a little slow to really understand and explain that. So the importance of framing, you know, those are just a couple of sort of big examples, if you like, key choices that news organizations can make. But it's really important also to think about the other end of the scale, which is coming down practically really to individual words. You know, the use of language, the use of words is so critical in how we convey what we convey to audiences and what you all take from what you see and hear. So it really can be at the level of individual words. I mean, take the Falklands War, for instance, you know, which I remember early on. I mean, there was outrage from the Thatcher government that the BBC would not talk about our troops. We talked about British troops. We talked about British troops and Argentinian troops. We did not talk about our troops. And this was somehow deemed to be unpatriotic. But we regarded our job for British and indeed global audiences, the patriotic thing was to do our job well, which was to report and to report accurately and allow audiences to make up their mind and not, you know, be part of the political narrative or argument, which of course we would report and cover and reflect different views of as well. But as the BBC, our job is to report accurately. Another phrase more recent that became really wide currency, the Arab Spring, very commonly used. But actually at the BBC, we were quite quick to think harder about language and generally and mostly really tried to talk about the Arab uprisings. It really shouldn't have taken years of the hindsight of the following years to understand that there wasn't a rose-tinted paradise emerging out of all those heartfelt demonstrations. And it shouldn't have surprised us because actually, of course, the Prague Spring, which I think was a phrase that perhaps inspired the Arab Spring for people, that didn't exactly lead to a democratic summer either. So just be really careful all the time about how language can very quickly become a currency and stick again to, well, what's actually going on here? There are some uprisings. A more delicate, controversial word that we grappled with over the years, terrorism, terrorists. From a World Service perspective, it always felt reasonably straightforward that these words could be loaded, that, one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter, and that our job when reporting was to focus on what had happened rather than descriptors. So, a car bomb exploded, killing 3, or, people ran in terror from the gunman as he fired indiscriminately, and let people make up their own mind. And of course, again, quote those who might be describing or calling a particular group or individual a terrorist, but kind of leave that to others, not necessarily our job. The BBC came under some criticism for this at times when, if you like, it seemed sort of obvious that something was terrorism or that someone was a terrorist. I was always more comfortable with the notion that something was was an act of terror than always understanding the motivation of individuals. But I really did understand why, when things came home to roost in London in the 7/7 London bombings, that the BBC's sort of reluctance about this word somehow did seem as if we didn't understand what was happening in our own country. But for me, there are always exceptions that prove the rule. And overall, I think the BBC's commitment to keep explaining why it thinks so hard about the language it uses and how hard it works to avoid sort of politicization and focuses on reporting rather than hasty judgment, I think is right. I think, we'll come, I'm sure, much more to talk about other aspects of framing, but just a few remarks about the challenges of global reporting. So one thing about geopolitics, of course, is that in some ways, it happens in quite a boring way. Sometimes it happens at conferences and the G7 and the corridors of power. And I actually take my hat off to diplomatic and other correspondents who do a great job to make those events and get under the skin and make them engaging and really, try to bring home to audiences what's going on at these big events. But of course, geopolitics is always also about people. And, that's why it is so important to have correspondents, whether, foreign correspondents going abroad or indeed people working in their own countries to report and help bring alive from the ground what's going on. And, it's not easy. Global journalism is under huge pressure in some parts of the world. So last year, 2024 was one of the worst for deaths and imprisonment. It's not just war zones, which you might immediately think of. In some years, assassinations in places in Central and Latin America of journalists investigating drug cartels or environmental crime, have almost outnumbered what you might call sort of classic hostile environment conflict zone deaths. In 2024, the International Federation of Journalists says that 122 journalists and media workers were killed. And the Committee to Protect Journalists, reported in 2024, 360 journalists behind bars. 2025 is going to be worse, and that is because the numbers are dominated by the deaths of journalists in Gaza. Again, the Committee to Protection of Journalists says that in 2025, up to mid-August 2025, 192 journalists, 184 of them Palestinian, have been killed in Gaza, which is a shockingly deadly toll. As I'm sure many of you know, international journalists are not allowed to report from Gaza. And organisations like the BBC, but many others, and this goes to an important point Jeremy was talking about, have worked really hard with local and Palestinian journalists to support their reporting and to bring it out and to help integrate it into reports for audiences, right around the world. But as you can hear, the toll on Palestinian journalists has been extensive. So we've also found that working with civilians, I'm sure you all have heard or seen the reports where a teacher perhaps or a doctor or someone that a news organisation can work with over time to verify and build the credibility and have a sense of real trust and honesty, and to be very clear about what the reporting is and what it's not. This has been a really, really important part of keeping coverage going, just as, of course, organisations of the BBC continue to report extensively from within Israel itself. The citizen journalism can be a very important part of covering events like this, but of course, it's not a substitute for expert journalism as well. Elsewhere, there are other war zones where the rules of war regarding the protection of journalists are frankly fraying. Iraq and Syria were particularly challenging. So again, large news organisations can support their correspondents with training, with hostile environment training, with security and high risk support in the team. But of course, that's not always available to local journalists or freelancers. There are other hazards. It's not just about the war zones. And in fact, again, we come back to the sort of shifting balances of power in geopolitics, where you're trying to understand governments, you're trying to understand policy, what's going on. Well, working in a repressive regime ain't easy. In China now, BBC and other foreign journalists have routinely followed and controlled wherever they want to go. In Russia, again, you may well know the BBC now only has one correspondent, the magnificent Steve Rosenberg. The Russia service journalists all went into exile and are in the Baltics, which is not necessarily what these, again, young and wonderful journalists would have signed up to when they joined the BBC. BBC Persian journalists work from the UK, knowing that their families are often harassed in really significant and painful ways back in Iran itself. Now, if foreign journalists face challenges, well, they know that, usually they have a government supporting them behind, and of course, they can leave. They can leave. Again, this is not available to the many, many brave local journalists. I do think, we may talk more about this, that the partnership, as Jeremy began to touch on, between foreign and local journalists is so much stronger than it used to be. And there is so much more local journalism that finds its way around the world, which is good to see. So, I just say all this because I'm sure many of you know it, but just to reinforce that any support you can give to some of these, aspects of the challenges of global journalism are very welcome. I'm going to stop there, except to say that although I haven't touched, overtly and directly on the issues of credibility and how to build good journalism in a crazy, crazy world, and I'm sure we'll talk more of that. I hope in a way you can see that in everything I've talked about, I've been dancing around or alluding to what is the most important thing, and it's about trust and fact-checking, verification. These are so important. They do take time, as Jeremy said, but what they are all contributing to over time, and it does take time, is to build trusted organizations and brands that people know they can trust. And the one thing that gives me comfort is that we do know that in the end, through the noise, most people do turn at some point, maybe as a second source, or when the news is a really big thing, they've got to check in to trusted brands. And by and large, most people understand who they can trust and who they don't. But it takes a great deal of work. It takes a great deal of patience, and often the trusted brands have less money than the less trustworthy brands. And so again, understanding ownership, follow the money, follow who's really driving what's going on is something important to think about too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. This was extremely interesting. Roger, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, well, thank you, and thank you for being here tonight, and for this very distinguished colleagues I'm with. Just as a sign, actually, that not all of us come from a monolithic point of view within the BBC. Actually, I disagree with what Mary said about terrorism, and I think if you look at 9/11 or you look at 7/7 and some of the other incidents, they are by any definition terrorism. That's what the word means and what they are. And therefore, actually, I think you risk losing the audience's trust if you don't call something what they know it to be. So we can maybe discuss that a bit later on. And I think I come from the point of view that I'm very much in awe of Jeremy's expertise. And the fact, though, is that to me, journalism is quite simple. And journalism is about telling people what's going on and giving them the facts. And there is this temptation now in an age of opinion and disinformation, which is all real, that journalism is changing. And you do have a lot of social media, you do have a lot of opinion. But what reporters and correspondents should be doing, what news organizations should be doing, is telling people what is going on in the world. And not what the opinion about it is, but what the facts are. How many people were killed in the attack today? What is the government of Israel saying? And getting those basics right remains the core job of journalism. Now, as Mary said, and I do agree about this very much, there are biases. Of course there are biases. There are biases of selection. There are biases of omissions. And I think I can say, as an editor in television news and on radio over many years, I think I never knowingly put anything about South America on the air. There are journalistic blind spots. And there are times when also journalists sort of go to a narrative which turns out not to be true. And I think the best example of that was the start of the Ukraine war, when everyone was standing on their rooftop in Kiev and really waiting for the Russians to come into Kiev. And every so often I would read something or see something online about, very cold weather, mud, Russian tanks stuck in the mud. And I was kind of thinking, maybe they should be reporting this. Is the Russian advance really going in the way they thought? But there was this kind of assumption that Russia would just sweep through into Kiev. And I think you have to all the time challenge your information and work out where it is the story is actually going. Now, I think there are a number of other things you've got to watch out for. Clearly, agendas are sometimes driven by governments and international agendas. If the EU holds a summit on Africa, people talk about Africa. If they don't hold a summit on Africa, you may well not. There's also that herd mentality, the sense that journalists sometimes think that the right thing to do is be where all the other journalists are and to report those stories. And I think going with that, and again, Mary and I may disagree slightly about this, you can have a particular worldview in journalism, which is generally a bit metropolitan, a bit liberal. It didn't really understand Brexit. It doesn't really understand Make America Great Again. And those are factors, I think, which, again, can risk undermining trust. Though it also has to be said that you are now seeing in America something, and again, Jeremy will be more expert in this, but that kind of jingoistic, war-encouraging reporting is now what you are increasingly getting into the mainstream in America. And I was just looking today at a list of all the kind of corporate moves and takeovers in America, which will have the effect of making a much more right-wing media in America. So when people used to talk about liberal mainstream media in America, it could now be going very dramatically the other way. And we've seen the effect that Trump has in polarizing. Now, I'm going to sort of zip through very quickly a few things I think that journalism could do to help with those framing issues and to help make journalism more powerful. Sometimes switch off social media. Social media just chatters away, and in the same way that correspondents can, in a worst case, be stuck on the roof of a building talking about what's going on inside that building without really knowing, you don't need everyone speculating about things. You need to know what the facts are. Go out and find a story. Go and talk to people. Be cleverer as well, so that sometimes international affairs are incredibly complex. And therefore, the simple answer is not necessarily the answer that is the right one. It may be sometimes that there is a level of detail or an understanding of policy that can really help shape audiences' opinions more than just what you happen to read on X or Facebook. Also, tell me something I don't know. There's lots of things we do know. And I think, again, that can sometimes be, you can put Trump through a prism of Trump is, ghastly and wrong about everything. But actually, there are some times when Trump's diplomacy can be effective. And you've got to look at trying to dissect what it is that he does well amidst whatever your approval or disapproval is of him generally. Leave the reaction to commentators. So for reporting, the best reporting, and I remember Mary being a brilliant reporter in Eastern Europe a couple of decades ago, that you don't need to kind of give your views and what you think about it. If you do the reporting properly, you can convey things. And then also, there was an old Director General of the BBC called John Burt, who had something called the significance test. What really matters? And I think journalists should think about that all the time. There was a rather bad moment for the BBC, I think, 2-3 years ago, when they went all around the world to G7 in Tokyo. And the first question that the political editor asked of Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, was what he made about the controversy over Suella Braverman's parking fines. And that was the topic of the day in Sunday newspapers. It was not about climate change. It was not about Ukraine. It was not about geopolitics. It was about a trivial bit of UK politics. So always think about significance. If you get it out all right, though, as Jeremy said, remember Watergate, remember the Ethiopia famine and the way that journalism exposed that and brought it to the attention of the world. In the UK in the past year or two, it was journalism that exposed Mohammed al-Fayed. It was journalism that brought down the Archbishop of Canterbury. Journalism could do wonderful things, and I think it should hold its nerve, be confident, stick to its traditional values, albeit on different platforms. And that will distinguish journalism and serve our public good much better than just going into a kind of digital bucket of all sorts of nonsense. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roger. This was fascinating. And thank you again. All of you actually answered most of my questions, the main questions I sent you in advance. Thank you. I have a couple of questions, some more questions to have a mini round table, and then I'm very interested in looking into the audience questions we have, and I would like to encourage our attendees again to put their questions in the Q&A box, and I'm going to read them out soon. I guess I'm very interested in, all of you talked about credibility and trust, and I was wondering if you see any differences in terms of to the extent to which people trust journalism, journalists. Are there any differences between generations? All of you work with students a lot, and I was just wondering if you see any changes in terms of generations. Students today, for example, university students, compared to students a few decades ago.
Since my two colleagues are muted, I'll jump in first. I think there is. Look, I'm very proud of Selwyn students who've often said to me when they're looking at social media or other reports that they then often go to the BBC or The Economist or the FT or the New York Times to check whether it's true or not. I think that's good, and I think the instincts in Cambridge are good. Generationally, of course, conventional TV news is now really for older audiences and older people. And young people now get their news from a multiplicity of digital sources. I think the hope for conventional broadcasting, conventional journalism, is that a lot of what's on social media originates from conventional media. If you look at the last election campaign in Britain, most of the viral clips were actually from the ITV debate or the BBC debates or from the reporting on a particular issue. And equally, a lot of the factual items about Israel and Gaza come from proper mainstream journalism, including Al Jazeera and a whole range of other people. So I think that core is still there. But I think there is a bit of a tendency to focus on what you feel about it, what you believe about it, rather than necessarily as much on what's actually going on. I think you've got to keep, of course, people must have opinions, they must have views, but try to make them as factually based as possible would be the recommendation, I think.
Yeah, I agree with that, and add that I think it's inevitably, because just of the sheer volume of stuff that young people are subject to, it is progress that they have often developed a general sense that it's cool to be suspicious. And of course, it is cool to be suspicious. But I sometimes think we've made young people so suspicious that they dismiss everything, and that the notion that anything is grounded in, reality is suspect, and that objectivity is impossible and impartiality is impossible, and we're all way too knowing. And there was a lot of efforts in schools to develop media literacy, which I think is really important. But I think the early days of media literacy taught everybody not to trust, as opposed to work out who you shouldn't trust, but who you can trust. And, as Roger says, I think the smartest young people do come to realize that actually there are trustworthy sources, and you can kind of work out badges and reasons to understand who you can trust. Is a news organization transparent about its sourcing? If you really want to look for it, can you find their values? Can you find their editorial principles, their editorial guidelines? Can you compare and contrast and fact check, and over time think, no, this is proving reliable? So that would be the one thing that I would add, is that young people need help to understand that trust is possible, and that objectivity and impartiality may not be flawless, but they are very, very good aspirations, and we can get quite far towards them.
Maybe one more thing to add to this question about trust and generation, Elvira. I don't know if this is helpful at all, but it's not come up, so I'll put it on the agenda. Although it's implicit in the yellow journalism problem and the war between Pulitzer and Hearst, was about the fact that news also operates in a market. It is organized by BBC and, interestingly enough, now defunded public broadcasting system in the United States. Apart, although they do have to compete as well. And both Roger and Mary, I wonder what your thoughts are on this need. It's not just a attentional competition in the media age, which I think what was Elvira was getting at, is also the nature that there is the problem of the nature of the market for information and for news. And I think one of the problems that's been showcased of late, and that adds to the reputational problem of the media, which is the environment in which journalists function, is this dimension of it. And I think for anybody who's been following the issues around the sacking of Jimmy Kimmel and Stephen Colbert, who are late night TV hosts, they are not journalists, but is this relationship between, let's say, journalism and entertainment, and the need to command attentional powers, that ABC and NBC, which now rely very heavily on their news programming as a revenue source, as they become less and less important as entertainment sources, being edged out by Netflix and other sources, are also regulated by the power of the state. And they, as media companies looking to sell off or to buy assets, worried about the FCC's controls over them, lead to the sacking of these, let's say, influencers like Stephen Colbert and Jimmy Kimmel. The paradox is that, though this debate has been going on for a very long time, and it comes to Roger's important point about, I think Roger used the term traditional values. Um, uh, um, in the wake of the scandals surrounding yellow journalism, it was paradoxically Joseph Pulitzer himself who had a bit of a crise de coeur about what had happened, that led to a crusade to try to professionalize journalism itself, create the Columbia School of Journalism, begin to talk about standards of, validation, verification that Mary was talking about. I think of these more in terms of just ongoing tensions that take different forms and different stages rather than something that has any pure solution one way or the other. But I do think that trust and credibility, yields these issues about trust and credibility and what in an age in which news itself is a commodity.
Thank you so much. Very, very interesting. And I have slightly related question regarding the current training of journalists. I assume you speak to several young aspiring journalists, and I wonder about their main concerns, if there's anything that has changed in the past years, and if the training, the education of journalists, their preparation have changed due to current conflicts or issues in recent years.
I suppose I would just say that the training at the journalism schools and somewhere like the BBC and other papers, the fundamentals have probably not changed massively. It's basically everything that Roger was talking about. But what has changed is the craft skills, the storytelling skills, the digital skills, and the need as a journalist now, and you can, discuss whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, but it's just the truth, and it goes back to Jeremy's market point, the need for one individual to be able to do everything and to do it very fast and get it out on lots of platforms. So, yeah, that's what I would say on training.
Yes, I agree with Mary. I mean, I'm very struck really in media generally that in some ways it has all changed totally in a time that I had a career in media. And then on the other hand, a lot of it's still the same. So if you look at the jobs that Steve Rosenberg and Jeremy Bowen and Lise Doucette and Katya Adler are doing, they're largely the same jobs, and they're doing it. I mean, you should never underestimate the bravery of journalists, and some of the things that we see them doing on our behalf are incredible. And as Mary said, the risk to journalists is enormous. And I think that I would just keep saying that the core of honest, accurate, factual reporting and being brave in getting that and representing us when they're on the ground, those are things that you look for in journalists.
Thank you so much. And I think it's time to turn to our audience questions. First one, how does one balance being patriotic and supportive of your country and at the same time being unbiased when reporting on geopolitical issues?
I think that I'm going to, I hope this isn't inappropriate, I'm going to do a sport analogy here because it's something that we grappled with a lot in London 2012. And that's the question of how much were we Team GB and how much were we reporting the Olympics in which you could be pleased if anybody won. And I think there is a place you can get to in which you are clearly British and supportive of Team GB, and which, on the other hand, you also report fairly on other people. And I think to take that slightly inappropriate sporting analogy and put it into then the most difficult contexts of conflicts and wars, on Mary's point earlier, I don't think there's any doubt that the BBC would have wanted the soldiers and airmen and sailors of the RAF and Navy and Army to be safe, and they did think that getting rid of the Argentinian junta out of the Falklands was probably the right thing to do. And I think that you can have a set of cultural assumptions which we have to some degree in the Ukraine-Russia war. We generally think that Ukraine is the victim and Russia is the aggressor. But you can still report objectively and fairly on that without, as Mary said, giving hostages to fortune by saying, come on our boys. But I think in any democratic country, there is a bit of a sense of going where the democratic will of that country is on these major conflicts.
Yeah, I would really agree with that. And I would just add that it's a really interesting question, this, because I don't think journalists sit around wondering about how to balance doing their job and being patriotic. In Britain, we are blessed, I guess, that one can be quite unthinkingly and instinctively patriotic about a country which believes generally in freedom of speech, accuracy, fairness, and that therefore the values that are what people are really thinking about when they do their job, which is what are my journalistic values and how am I doing a good job journalistically, can be front of mind, and don't necessarily put you in conflict with the core values and indeed actually the legal and regulatory approach of this country.
I think it's a very good question, and it begs perhaps a follow-up, which is, are truth and honesty a patriotic value? And I think one of the agonies of watching what's happening in the United States nowadays is, and the formation of, what are called truth silos, is that this question of openness and honesty as a value is being demoted in favor of news that reinforces my preconceived notions of what the world should look like. I think that's a real difficult, and that may be the difficult slippery slide that we're in now. It is worth saying, to the person who posed the question, that there have been many episodes in the past, sorry to sound like the historian, we've seen all this before, and I would spotlight the Vietnam War and what was happening in the 1970s, perhaps globally, with the peak of the heroic narrative about journalists, that journalists were being accused. It's called the stab in the back narrative, that it was journalists who led to the failure, the only failure until Iraq and Afghanistan came along, of the American military. And this is something that is seething in Donald Trump, it's worth saying. Were the journalists out there reporting on what was happening in Vietnam, undermining the national cause in search of what they thought was the truth? And one might say we've been slowly, American public sphere, and we're all paying a price for it, outside the United States, have been vexed by this problem.
I just want to pick up actually on one thing that Jeremy said, and I was looking earlier today at the BBC feed about Jimmy Kimmel, in which the headline, I think rather bizarrely, even for the BBC, the headline was "Jimmy Kimmel appeared to mislead the public," says regulator after host suspension. And they then quote the Trump-appointed director of the FCC, chairman of the FCC, saying that what he said was not a joke. I mean, the thing is that free speech is about jokes. Free speech is about getting things wrong. So journalism is about getting it right. But equally, you have to allow for opinion and error and mistake, and jokes and all sorts of things are part of what free speech are. So those two things, I think, are happening in parallel. And it's really, really concerning what's happening in America now.
Thank you very much.
Can
Our
I
next question.
Sorry, Elvira.
Yes, sorry. Yeah, please.
On this point about America, and I would just to say, actually, Roger, I really do agree with you about collective journalistic failures to, get it right about Brexit and indeed about Trump. But so many assumptions that it just wouldn't happen, it couldn't happen, and somehow if it does happen, it was wrong, or people who voted that way were, wrong. I think there really were limitations to reporting. I don't disagree with that at all. But I think one of the challenges for the states, but not just the states, is how to do really, really good reporting that from the ground understands and reports on how people think, why they think what they think, what their views really are, and not just do East Coast, West Coast, or in Britain's case, just kind of London and maybe a bit of Scotland, but at the same time preserve the space to put it in a context that says when something maybe perfectly a view held in good faith but is not correct, or put the context around it to show that a change in policy is outside and beyond the normal norms within states, which I think Jeremy, is something we're seeing so much of now. One of the things that it was really interesting to me in the last few years, and it's still really true, in fact, even more so, is that the BBC's reputation in the United States as a trusted brand has grown and grown and grown, which is a little bit counterintuitive, except that in a world of unbelievably polarized media in the States, it just shows there is space for something that tries to look at things in the round with a range of views, and people do seek that out. But no, I think there are real concerns about the States, and of course there are plenty of other places in the world where there have long been concerns, but this is perhaps a newer one.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to, thank you very much, turn to our next question. What are your thoughts on podcasters and comedy news shows like The Daily Show in the US? Do you think that they have the same responsibilities as journalists, given that a fair amount of young people receive their news from podcasts and entertainment news shows?
Well, I'll be brief on this, although I just a little where Mary, just to pick up on something Mary just said. I spend a fair amount of time in El Salvador in the last few years, and it really is worth reminding ourselves. We can get very obsessed, and I'm sorry that what's happening in the United States is spilling over into my challenged attentional capabilities and therefore spilling into the screen here. But uh, in the wider world where people get news, is very often filtered by the platforms that they subscribe to in order to get access to internet on their phone. So their devices are the means to consume news, and it comes through Facebook or Meta, and it comes and um, and so the algorithmic sorting of what people like to see and the advertisements that are the source of the revenues for these firms shapes very much with the news that they get in much of the world. So while are alarmed about the United States, I think there's a much wider world of the political economy of the media and journalism that is almost more dangerous and may tell us what's coming for the rest of us Homo sapiens. Um, on podcasts, it's a space unto itself, and I don't think there is a difference between since I listen and I have a podcast, I have BBC app on my phone. I consume a certain amount of my news that way. Ezra Klein's show on the New York Times is kind of a regular, and so on and so forth. But I think of that as different form of journalism than yes, than the entertainment form of podcasts, though they inhabit the same space. That's always been the case. And that was the case in 19th century print journalism. That was the case on television, which bundled different kinds of products for different kinds of utilities. And I think it's really important to sort that one out, though in practice, they often bleed into each other.
Yes, I think there's a spectrum, and I probably sort of maybe sounded a bit jumbled a few minutes ago, but that spectrum has news bulletins, newspapers, articles that are about current affairs on one end, right through to comedy entertainment on the other. And there are different standards of accuracy and compliance you have in all those different forms. My point is that core journalism, or BBC News, CBS News, CNN, even Fox News, should be about accurate facts. And you can then have commentary and discussion about them, and you can have amusing podcasts, and you can have comedy shows like The Daily Show. And there are different levels of accuracy and compliance within those. I think people generally understand that. And clearly, if a show like The Daily Show commits a serious libel, that is still covered by appropriate legal or regulatory comeback. But I think the late shows in America issue is about entertainment comedy shows. They're not about journalism. And on those shows, you can say what you think. And to have the FCC say, well, we didn't like that, and somebody being taken off air for it is shocking.
Thank you. Our next question goes, what are your thoughts no, sorry, the three of you have mainly discussed broadcast journalism. Would you be able to talk about the role of radio? Do you think that radio is a better way for people to consume news as they are free from images, which are used by journalists to cause an emotional response? And actually, this question very much reminds me of the events we had in January on documentary and war, where we discussed documentaries and photojournalism in detail. So I'm very, very curious about your thoughts.
Oh, I'll dive in on this one. When I mean, Jeremy's kind of said this. When newspapers started, great, and then the photographs arrived, and people were very worried about the photographs. And then radio came along. People were very, very worried about radio. Television came along. Oh my goodness, television is worrying. Social media. Oh my goodness. Every new medium and platform with increased capacity sort of, freak people out even more. But here we all are. And actually all of them have found their place. And my goodness, I mean, the notion that a picture is innately more emotional than the power of words, as somebody who started their career in radio, I just don't buy it. It's all about how you use the words, the image. It's about what you structure it into. It's about the power of the reporter. In television, it's about the combination of the words and the images. In radio, sometimes it's about the silences, just as it is about the words. So radio is a fantastic medium. It's an absolutely brilliant medium. You can get sometimes more information per minute from radio than television. So if kind of that's your bag, if you think about the classic evening half-hour radio bulletin compared to the classic evening television bulletin, you will probably cover more stories in radio than in television. But my goodness, pictures can be informative. So I'm rather challenging the assumption of the question there. They all have their place.
I agree 100% with Mary.
Yeah, and I would just to echo the advent of radio news, radio broadcasting was enormously controversial, and it's not as if the radio was immune from we use the word populist uses at the time, not least in Germany in the 1930s. So I do think we should be let's say cautious about technological reductivism, as if it's the machine that determines the message or its abuse, for instance. And so Mary used a concept of media literacy or visual literacy I think we should be talking much more. I think like this webinar, not podcast, that Elvira has pulled together, I think we need to be talking much more. I wish Cambridge had a curriculum organized around media and communication studies, something like that, since to elevate the understanding of what's happening. But I don't think just the machine alone determines the logic of how we talk and represent news.
Thank you so much. One attendee asks, what would you suggest is the best and most effective way for aspiring journalists to become a part of reputed international news platforms like the BBC?
Well, I have conspicuously failed in my time in Cambridge to get anybody onto a BBC training scheme, I'm afraid. But there are lots of other good training schemes as well. The BBC does do some good training schemes, but Bloomberg, The Telegraph, lots of other good training schemes. And I think generally when I'm giving people advice about going into media, the media industry is fragmenting. It's got lots of pressures on it, lots of financial pressures. News is still one of the relatively structured and slightly more secure areas. And for as long as you have Sky News and ITV News and BBC News in the UK and other major broadcasters around the world, there is going to be a career in news, I really hope. And I think it's interesting that a couple of the questions have just talked about this point about training and getting the right people. And only if you get people in and give them that training do they become the Jeremy Bowens and the Katya Adlers of the next generation. So I really hope that continues.
I have only one piece of it's kind of banal, perhaps, but and it's less about training and more about experience. But it would be to for a young person who wants to be involved in storytelling and reportage is to step outside your comfort zone. There's an image in the PowerPoint of Lindsay Addario. Read her memoirs. It's very interesting. She's a wonderful photojournalist. But she got started in a study abroad program out of the United States, living in Argentina at the time, in the wake of the dictatorship, when the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo were demonstrating in a crusade for human rights there. And it was her experience and encounters there that got her into so leaving a little bit, thinking about what the story looks like from another person's perspective was for her enormously influential in setting her off on a trajectory.
Thank you very much. Our next question. How can journalists gain credibility when covering the situation in Israel and Gaza when foreign journalists aren't allowed to enter Gaza? The BBC, for the most part, mentions that the information being provided has not been verified due to the ban on foreign journalists, but it's not the case with broadcasters in the US and France. How are people expected to believe the coverage coming out of Gaza when there aren't any foreign journalists on the ground?
Well, Israel should allow journalists into Gaza. I mean, that is absolutely, I think, essential. And when a story of the magnitude of Gaza is happening, there should be first-hand reporting. I think the question is not quite right. And I don't think the BBC says it can't verify information from Gaza. It does quite often. If you see reports sometimes on the 10 o'clock news by Fergal Keane, that Fergal Keane is putting those reports together in Jerusalem based on trusted local freelance reporters in Gaza. And the BBC does therefore report as best it can what's happening on the ground in Gaza. But absolutely, journalists should be allowed in there. And at the moment, the difficulty of conveying the horror is enormous for journalists, and it is clearly hampered by those reporting restrictions.
Yeah, I mean, just to add, and we talked about it a little bit earlier, that in a situation like this, working with journalists, on the ground in a country is so important, and finding those that you can work with and trust. Jeremy, at the very, very beginning, talked about the importance of, or the shift perhaps from the days where the sort of the foreign correspondent kind of arrived from Washington or London and was a sort of knight in shining armor and stayed in the best hotel and sort of did a bit of reporting and told everybody how things were and then left. And of course, the best foreign correspondents are not like that any longer. They build up real expertise. But I do think there is still a place for them, even in a world where that strengthening and supporting local journalists is really important. And for instance, the BBC World Service, all the various language services, many of them now are based in country, and a lot of the journalists are local recruits rather than people who've been, parachuted in from London, and that is brilliant and really, really good and talented people. But there is a place still for the mix. I mean, there was an interesting time with Myanmar, for instance, where there was a patch, recently where the military regime, there's another word. When is a government a regime? Particularly repressive, particularly again around journalists, and our local journalist was detained and imprisoned for a while, and so on. And a lot of other local journalists were really having to hide away or self-censor, or literally just not report. And being able to go in from London, report, without fear of favour, and leave, sometimes that is a really, really important, precious thing. And it's why, as Roger says, it is so important that international or really broad range of journalists be allowed into Gaza. It's absolutely woeful.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard to say what is, which scandal is worse. What's around what's happening in Gaza, just the fact of the atrocities, or the fact that we aren't more scandalized by Israel's control over the state of Israel's control over access to the sources. But it is worth saying that never before while there's more, let's say, um, organized, curated reportage on and control on one level, there have never been more active, let's say, watchdog organizations around the media itself. I mean, it's as if we live in a world of more thoughtful, verified, fact-checking all over the place, and at the same time, um, efforts to exercise control over the story, over a representation. Um, that's perhaps added, just to go back to your very first question, Elvira, the say the crisis of credibility is that these two spheres exist in tension with each other.
Thank you so much. Another attendee asks, earlier there was a mention of the issue with current journalists who frame their reporting with a cosmopolitan European mindset, particularly regarding MAGA, Brexit, and populist movements. Is this a big issue? How would the BBC reports balance the interpretation of political movements from facts on the ground?
I think Mary and I think, as we've indicated, we're pretty much on the same lines here, actually. That I think sometimes there's looking at people in populist movements as somebody in America in the last election said, a bit like specimens in a zoo, that you kind of go and look at these people who are not part of the sort of conventional metropolitan chattering classes, and treat them as slightly exotic animals with strange views that you go and look at and then sort of recoil slightly from. And I think you can. There is I think he's now the home editor, I think, in the BBC, Ed Thomas. And Ed Thomas, I think, does some brilliant reporting in which he goes and gets the widest possible range of views, but everybody's on the same level. And he's not judgmental. He reports what people are saying. He looks at the dilemmas that are caused by the kind of views there. And he doesn't come to any particular conclusion, but he really does illuminate the thinking on the ground. And I think the most obvious example in Britain was the Brexit referendum, where if you were talking to people in BBC local radio about their phone-in programmes, they were jam-packed full of Brexiteers, and yet people sitting in London in the management offices thought Remain was going to win. And you've just got to kind of bridge those two things.
Thank you very much. Someone asks, going back to the first question here, what does it actually mean? And do journalists need to take a patriotic stance when reporting, especially in such a polarized world? So this is referring back to the first question about patriotic reporting.
I'll just be controversial and say, not really. No, I mean, journalists are not employed to take a patriotic stand. They're employed to be good journalists. I mean, of course, it's not, quite as simple as that. And Roger, I think, was very eloquent about, of course, any journalist, especially if you're reporting on domestic stories that matter to your own domestic audience. You are in a particular country, a particular place with a particular public. But again, if we are going to talk about patriotism, I think it's really important to think carefully about what patriotism means. And patriotism does not mean you necessarily are doing the will of the government. People can be patriotic in very different ways. Sometimes the patriotic thing, might be to actually stand against the government. And people in any given country are not a monolith. So again, there is a range of views. And I'm not saying journalists, shouldn't be patriotic or ever think about it, but it is not the front of mind task or thing to be thinking about when you get up in the morning to go off and do some good journalism. You should think about doing the good journalism, and actually, hopefully, the rest will follow.
I think some of the difficulty and why this question keeps coming up, and it's probably because, of course, there's a flag story behind what's going on nowadays, actually all over the place. Recently in Brazil, and clearly the colors of the Brazilian flag have really been a subject of an enormous amount of debate and discussion, some of it actually quite violent, around who owns the flag. And I think it goes to Mary's question about what does it mean to be patriotic anymore, and the slide into tribal understandings of what the nation is committed to. I think, though, at the same time, I'm going to reframe the question back to Roger and to Mary as a problem that journalists have to struggle with between the universal commitments to truth as something that applies to all humans, regardless of their sexual orientation, their race, their location, their religion, something that perhaps began out of a response to religious wars in Europe, versus a commitment to community and now defined as the national community. And that this is just something that is, I mean, it may be just a matter of making it more explicit what the tension is, but this is a problem for journalism more than it is for doctors. Just to kind of, we don't ask doctors to be patriotic and sing anthems before they operate. Yet this is being posed to journalists.
I think debate makes us stronger. And I think if you look at some of the rights that have been won in this country over the years on, race and gender and sexuality, if you look at the case for gay marriage, I mean, 20 years ago, Hillary Clinton was against it, and actually the arguments won. But you only do that by having the arguments. I think that, some aspects of journalism, current affairs programs, debate programs, can surface those issues and put arguments and can win people over. So I think if you suppress ideas and cancel people and shut people up, that actually is counterproductive. But ultimately, in a free society, free journalism, free debate are what wins gains for all of us.
Mary, were you going to say something?
All I was going to say is that Jeremy used the word community, which is a powerful word. And for a lot of journalists, and we haven't talked much in this session about local journalism, local journalists and relationship with community, really, really important. So not the nation state, but your community. And these questions would probably have a slightly different charge and feel very real. But again, I just am tempted to say, well, what do you mean by community and whose community? I think I completely agree that it's a really, really important topic, and one that journalists and editors need to think about and grapple with. But there are, I would say, a great many pitfalls if patriotism becomes too front of mind for journalists who need to be going about doing their job, the ways that Roger's described without fear or favour. But very interesting.
Thank you so much. We have only a few minutes left, and we do have one last question. So I'd like to ask one of our attendees question: what do you think that schools can do in order to teach media literacy? Do you have recommendations for parents on how we can teach our children to become more media savvy?
Tell them all to sign up to the geopolitics seminar. No. But I think talk about the news, if you've got kids, talk about the news, maybe heavens above, even, if you can persuade them, watch the news together or show interest in what they're consuming, get them to tell you what news they're maybe seeing on social media. And in a kind of undidactic way, explore why they like certain YouTubers or sources and how they know what they know and what's the sourcing and what's the evidence. Just make it a conversation. And schools, I think, do try. I mean, they've got a busy curriculum, but I think it's important that they do. Although, as I say, I think helping people think about who to trust, not just to be savvy about not being too trusting, is important.
I'm more worried about adults and disinformation than I am about children, frankly. I think kids are actually much more sensible sometimes.
I mean, I think, there's much discussion, obviously, about issues of polarization. And I think one lesson we've learned from research that's being done on why we're living in an increasingly polarized world is actually it's a flip side of the media literacy question. I mean, how to put that into the curriculum of schools. But so to flip it over and say there is a practice that good journalists have that's very helpful to apply in everyday life in a polarized world. When you're in a conversation with someone with whom you may disagree, or you're very skeptical, they're in a different epistemics bubble than yours, but to be able to have the dialogue, which this world is going to need to figure out how we do this, is what's your source? How do you know what you know when you make that claim about vaccines or immigrants or Russians, or whatever it might be? And I think that is actually a helpful practice to think about in these moments of discord and entrenched misunderstanding. So there's another side to media literacy, which is what do good journalists do that the rest of the world might think of as might be handy in everyday life. I think talking about those dimensions too might be very helpful. Along the way, understanding what the media is, what it means when a reporter asks that question.
Thank you so much. We don't have any more questions in the Q&A box. I just would like to ask our speakers if there are any last minute thoughts that they like to share with us.
A for good journalism.
Yeah, it's not free. I think this illusion that the internet just, I hear to what Mary just said.
I agree. Consensus.
Thank you so much for this absolutely fascinating panel discussion. We had 3 extremely distinguished speakers, and I'm very happy that we made this happen. Thank you so much for all the questions to our audience members, all the thought-provoking questions we had. I put the website link, the Center for Geopolitics website link in the chat box. Please do follow us and attend our future events. Thank you so much once again, and have a good evening.
Thank you, Elvira. Thank you, everyone.